Can you see my screen? Is that all fine?
Beautiful, yes.
Okay, great. All right, so I titled my talk this afternoon, Histories and Hope, which is the title of the final chapter of the book, which I circulated for you to have a look at. But I'm going to talk partly about that and partly also about some very specific research projects that take narrative methods and use them in what I think are really quite interesting and creative ways. And that part of the talk will relate to the second article that I circulated, which looks at kind of the ways in which we can link narrative method to visual methodologies. So I hope that we're going to have some interesting conversation. I will start out with fairly kind of conventional sort of presentation with slides, but there will be space for breakouts along the way. I'm also going to use the chat box or invite you to use the chat box in a slightly directed sort of way. Of course, you can use it for anything that you wish, but at various points in the slides, I will suggest that you reflect on a question or a prompt, which you can do just for yourself and scribble on a piece of paper if you like, but it would be great if you would be willing to put it in the chat so that there's a kind of thread running alongside what I'm saying. So as Molly already said, I come from a research collective called Narrative Inquiry for Social Transformation. And this research network has had long links with, first of all, the Center for Narrative Research at UEL, and now the newly constituted Association for Narrative Research and Practice. So it's really very lovely for me to be able to participate in this free school, first of many, I hope. And I've put my email address on the slide, although I know that that you have it in any case on the circulating notices for the school, because I would really like to just invite anyone in this network, in the ANRP network, who'd like to join NEST, to please just drop me a line, because it would be great to have a kind of cross collaboration going forward. So I just want to very, very briefly speak about a little bit about the specific research projects that NEST is involved in at the moment. And that is, we have been very active for the last sort of 7 or 8 years. But I just wanted to share a little bit of what's happening at the moment. Sorry, I'm just moving this out the way. So I don't know what you can see. Can you just see me with the slide, or yeah? Okay.
We can see you and the slide, and it looks great.
Okay, good. All right. So I the first project that I just wanted to share with you is this wonderful collection, a book volume that is coming out in June this year, which focuses on the lives of 4 foundational African writers. It was the centenary of their births, all 4 of them coincidentally, in 2019. And this book collection was put together by Prof. Begiziswe Peterson, who was my co-principal investigator on NEST, who we lost to COVID last year, together with Kwezi Mkhize and Makosazana Kaba. Kwezi is also a NEST researcher, and Makosazana is a poet and a feminist scholar. And so this just gives you a kind of like an inkling of the sort of narrative work that is being done through NEST that takes us a little bit away from the more empirical sort of work that we've been talking about, mostly about this week. So a kind of project that really tries to excavate historical knowledge that comes in the form of literary work, but also in terms of social commentary that each of these four writers offer us in different ways. But the book is also remarkable because it draws on scholars from lots of different disciplines. So it's an edited collection, but it's not only contributions from literary scholars. So it gives you this feeling of how we are working across multiple disciplines and working very strongly with a kind of orientation towards recovering or recuperating, but also doing more than that, bringing into conversation in contemporary space historical figures, African intellectuals that have typically been kind of sidelined or kind of corralled into the space of literature on its own. This is for me a kind of delight because although I'm a psychologist and we've had some talk about that during the course of the week, and I'll talk some more about that, my first love is in fact literature. And so narrative has allowed me to move out of the confines of my discipline and into collaboration with artists and literary scholars and in fact people from many different disciplines. So it's also lovely for me this afternoon and through this week that there's, you know, many of the WITS participants, in fact almost all, are already NEST affiliated researchers, and so we're participating in the space as a collective, and it's been great to just be in conversation with everybody. So I'll just talk a little bit about the more sort of empirical projects that are ongoing. The first is what we call the Grandparents Project, which is an attempt to interview and collect the stories of old people across the country in 4 different geographical areas, in the sense of trying to grapple with individual stories that kind of map onto the larger historical trajectory of apartheid, post-apartheid, you can call it that, and to think about life histories in place and time. We were about to embark upon, and Kafue and Aya in particular are here in this capacity, a very specific project to explore the stories of old people in a part of Soweto that's called Dobsonville. So that's one project that we're involved in. And the second is a project that goes to the other end of the intergenerational spectrum, and that is working with young people, with youth. And this is a project that Haley and Petile initiated and are continuing to run with great enthusiasm. It's called Yachts, and that's the name that the young people themselves gave to the group. It's called Youth of the South. And Haley and Petile, as psychologists, are involved in psychosocial work with these young people. And we've also begun 3 different narrative threads in our work with these youth, finding ways in which we can insert the arts and narrative in particular into our work and our conversation with them. So the first is a reading group. These young people are reading the autobiographical work of Sisonke Msemang. It's called Always Another Country. It's about her life growing up in exile. They're using that text to think about her life, but also about their own. Then we have a group that's working on the visual arts, making screen prints actually, which I found like really exciting because in the 80s, that was a very typical tool for political kind of messaging. And so the young people are using that to think about their own messaging. And then the third element, which we're struggling a bit with, but the aim is that we will be able to produce a digital e-zine. So yeah, I'm pleased that you're in this conversation, Sarah. Maybe you can help us with that at some point. Okay, so I just wanted to sketch that for you a little bit, just so that you have a sense that of the kind of work that we're doing and how narrative can be used with this sort of agenda, which we call social transformation, but obviously that's because the acronym works really nicely to talk about NEST, but you might want to substitute a different word for transformation, but certainly change, or some kind of quite boldly stated objective to use narrative, not only to think about and know, but also to insert possibilities for change. So Corinne, when she invited me to participate in this school, she suggested that each of us might want to say why we use narrative. And so I thought for myself, like, so why do I? So I have three different kinds of answers to this. The first is that it enables me to remake the contours of my discipline in particular ways. In other words, it has epistemological potential, both within the discipline and also allowing me to go outside of it. Secondly, it gives me what I call a muscle for thinking and for living. It helps me to engage with the past and the future. So it has ontological potential, not only in the academic space, but actually in the practices of life. And thirdly, I find it incredibly creative, and it opens up areas of interest for me. And I actually think that a life that's interesting, a work that's interesting and meaningful is absolutely essential. So it has methodological potential for me. So I will think and talk in that sense, answering this why question, but I will also try to show you a little bit more of the how as well. So, so as Molly said, I recently produced this book, and the subtitle of the book is in fact the title that I wanted to use as the title, but the publishers were not keen on that title. They said it wouldn't work with clickbaits. So, but the focus being on changing subjects. And I use this word subject in multiple different ways. So it's a nice ambiguous word, and so it allows me to think and do different things. So it's partly about the subject or the discipline of psychology, and because the object of psychology's disciplinary focus is the human subject. And I'm interested in this subject who acts in that sense of like the grammatical subject of a sentence or an agent, but also who is simultaneously subject to or subjugated by the actions of others and the constraints of time and place, or history, if you like. And I try to engage this possibility for change, or the difficulties of change, through three different threads, which are all for me important ways of conceptualizing narrative. And those are they: relationality, temporality, and embodiment. And I'll try to speak to those a little bit this afternoon. So here's your first chat box question. How does narrative challenge or push your disciplinary boundaries? Okay, so many of us are in fact from psychology, but there are others in the room who are from different disciplines. So does narrative offer you these kind of possibilities for changing what is considered the disciplinary focus where you work? I sensed from an earlier conversation that there was some discussion in a drop-in session about the difficulties of doing this kind of work, because it's not easily recognized within disciplines, except perhaps in literature. So does narrative challenge your disciplinary boundaries, or which disciplines does it allow you to hop into for other resources? That's the first chat box question. Okay, so the first kind of ligament, if you like, or thread of my thinking around narrative is, I think, on the one that for me seems most kind of central, although all the others are, but the kind of obvious one is around an interest in temporality, a way of connecting the past, present, and future, and for working across generations. So Mark Freeman has this wonderful concept of the narrative unconscious, which is not same as a Freudian or psychoanalytic unconscious, but rather those stories of the past or of previous generations that that are part of our psyches, even if we did not live through them. So this is also what Eva Hoffman has referred to as the hinge generation, or the generation that comes after the experience, where one would ordinarily think, well, then that's not their experience, if it was the experience of parents or grandparents. But Mark offers us this, this concept of the narrative unconscious that filters in to our own experiences and shapes our psyches. Yeah, so William Faulkner has said this, which I think is a very well-known phrase: the past is never dead, it's not even past. So narrative is interested in the past and the way in which the past is present or filters into the present, but it's also interested in futures. And here, I mean, this idea of the current young generation who will be the future older generation is important. So this, of course, this idea of developmental lines of movement forward, which is very often associated with progress or things getting better. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that just now. But anyway, this for me is a kind of like, it does map onto the kind of very usually future orientated obsession of psychology that we're interested in prediction. So this positivist obsession that if we can develop scientific knowledge, we can say what will happen in the future. I don't think that narrative works with temporality in this way. So I'm going to just speak a little bit more about how I think narrative departs from this. Certainly temporality and pasts and futures are important. But for narrative scholars, there's a kind of twist in this notion of time, where the idea that the past leads to the present leads to the future is disrupted. So on the right-hand side of my screen, I've got this image, which I find just, you know, quite seductive. It like pulls me in. So the notion that, in fact, like, which I don't understand or know anything about, but that even the kind of things that seem solid and linear for us as ordinary people, as we live our lives, we are now aware that, in fact, time warps, that space is not kind of like static, and there's this notion of a wormhole through which one can enter a previous kind of like time zone. So there's this kind of movement between past, present, and future. And where, in fact, for me, the idea that we live in the current, in the present, is much more about the past and the future coinciding or colliding even, as rather than us moving just forwards. So Kierkegaard, another very famous aphorism, but he said that life is lived forward but can only be understood backwards. So there's some kind of element of a historical or reflective or thinking backwards rather than forwards. And Molly, in her beautiful book, Narrative Imagination, offers us this concept of time traveling, and that imagination is the way in which narrative works. So I'm going to just very briefly gesture towards this, because there's not enough time to talk about it in much detail, but this is where Vygotsky is important for me, where he offers us a conceptualization of cognition, mostly for psychologists, but for me it's much more than that. It's a conception of self, or the interior psyche, whereby language moves in. And this, for me, connects very, very strongly with how I understand the narrative conceptualization of the psyche or of personhood. So what language does when it moves in it does two things. One, it carries the cultural or social historical history into the individual person. And that I think we kind of know about, the ways in which the experiences of our particular contexts are transmitted through instruction, whether that be in families or in schools, but in also all kinds of other more diffuse sorts of ways in relation to discourse, in relation to media, etc., etc. But the important thing that Vygotsky alerts us to is that this doesn't go in some kind of like very static sort of way as a sort of storehouse of meanings and knowledge that we can draw on, but that language also functions internally to direct and regulate our action. So it has a kind of like, it has a productive capacity as well. And as I said, I can't really go into that in too much detail, but if anyone is interested, I could talk to you about that outside of the session. So basically, I'm making a claim that what happens is that narrative is not only that which is spoken in the world, and it's not only that which happens between people, but it's also internal. Right in the very heart of our most private and personal individual selves, that there is an internal dialogical narrative happening whereby we constantly are making ourselves in the stories, not only in the big stories, but on an ongoing, every like minute by minute kind of process. So yeah, I just want to point a little bit more to this idea of using the past to think about the present, but also trying to think about the future to understand the present. So the first image here is of a mythical bird, which comes from Ghanaian legend. It's called the Sankofa bird, and this bird flies forward but looks backwards. And very often students say to me, well, that sounds like a pretty dangerous thing to do because you might crash. But in actual fact, the point, of course, is that it's much more dangerous to just fly forward and not look back. So that this is the kind of like the sense that we can find wisdom by looking backwards instead of obsessing about trying to just move forward. So this has resonances, of course, with Walter Benjamin's Angel of History, the Paul Klee image painting that sums up his vision of the kind of like the debris, as he called it, of history piling up, the horror of what is confronted if you look back at history. So this vision is rather more horrific than the Sankofa vision, which despite the fact that it comes from a place where there is multiple historical traumas, the Sankofa bird is a little more focused on what it is that we can find in history, not only the horror that Benjamin suggests. And then just a slightly lighter version. This is a cartoon that I saw in the New Yorker recently. This a guy is obviously stepping out of a time machine. And he says, I went back to warn them, but they already knew and they didn't seem to care. So this set of images is suggesting that we try and think about the present from the perspective of the future, as well as from the past. So another chat box question for you. What do we think the present will look like from different vantage points of the future, where it will in fact, of course, be the past? So I think that the pandemic has done this for lots of us, to try and think about our experiences as less taken for granted and try and imagine. Because if we just think about 2 years ago, our lives were very, very different from what they are now. And so we're sort of in the midst of trying to kind of like create a sense or a coherence for things that are moving and shifting quite dramatically, and yet also at the same time, of course, the sense of being trapped in time and being unable to move. So I will move now to talk about the second thread of relationality. And these beads, which are from the cover of my book on the right-hand side, are beads that are made by a project in Zimbabwe, in Bulawayo. It's the Marigold Bead Project, and these beads represent a kind of like very fluid set of relationships, motility, and a connectedness between each of these tiny little beads into something that is bigger than each bead, obviously, and the pattern and flow of life. They're also beads that are both traditional and break with that tradition, because they are a very contemporary kind of interpretation, but they are connected to traditional bead making. So, so in relation to relationality, I want to again invoke this concept that Molly Andrews has given us, and that is the narrative imagination. So that the idea of relations between us stretches us to think about the lives of others, and much narrative work is exactly about this, but also to think of ourselves as if we were another. That's from Recur. So this idea of narrative imagination, or the failure of imagination, is very important when we do narrative work, in the sense of how far we can stretch our circles of relation, and why it is and how we sometimes close those down. So to keep working with this idea of the connections between people and our relationships. So here I also just want to point you to an African concept, and that is of Ubuntu, which might in fact be quite familiar to many of you, even if you are not yourselves African, because this word has become quite overused in the South African context, typically to refer to some kind of like sort of, I suppose, a kind of forgiving kind of like spirit. And the person, of course, who mostly has been associated with this word is the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So Ubuntu, of course, does kind of refer us to an ethics of relation, an ethics of care, and that is extremely important. But it's a much stronger, kind of more powerful term than that watered down version that I think is in the kind of general imaginary. And again, I can't go into this in much detail, but James Ogudu, who is also a literary scholar, has recently put out a trilogy of books on this topic. So you can see that there's a much thicker, deeper kind of domain that is contained in this word Ubuntu. But I think for me, one of the things that it offers us is, in addition to kind of alerting us to a form of ethics, and as I say, I don't want to undermine that. I think it's extremely important. But the concept is also important conceptually and theoretically for me. What it offers us is a different way of conceptualizing the human, or what it means to be an individual person. So Ubuntu refers to this kind of the extended phrase that Ubuntu is based on is umuntu ungumuntu ngabanye abantu, which literally translates as a person is a person through other people. In other words, it's not possible to be an individual person without this throughness, and I think that's really important. So if we think about this notion of relationality as central to narrative, we see that this disrupts the binaries that are typical of psychology, but I think typical of many social sciences, the binary between the self and the other, the individual and the social, the internal or the psychic interior, and the external or the social. So this is another way in which I think narrative is very powerful. Chat box question. Try to think about who the others are, who people your individual personal life story. Michelle Klein has got this wonderful notion that places and people are metabolized in our psyches, so that those other characters and those other persons, and indeed places, that are inside us, not just outside of us. Third thread, embodiment. Now this one, I suppose, is one of the ones that this I think is I mean, although there's been a turn to embodiment in much of social science and in psychological work around identities, for example, I think that in psychology, for example, this idea of the body has typically been placed at one end of a kind of an opposition between nature, or the body, and nurture, or the symbolic, or the domain of the social. And I think that narrative offers us a way of pulling these two things together, in that we can think of storytelling, or the use of language to tell our lives, as entailing both the material and the symbolic, not only the symbolic. So quite often when we think about narrative, or we think about discourse, we lift it out of the body, as if there is a domain that's only symbolic and not tied to the material. But of course, one of the remarkable things about language is that it's utterly natural. It's highly symbolic, obviously, that's what it's for, but it's also natural. We all do it, and so it's kind of just entwined in the constitution of human life. And here I want to just point you to the work of a Black psychologist, South African psychologist, who has written his own memoir very recently called Apartheid and the Making of a Black Psychologist. And here on the right is an image of him as an old man. He is still alive, he's still with us, and this is more what he looks like now. And why Mangani's work is so important to me is that he had this, so how did he become a psychologist, and why is it important to think about what it meant to be a psychologist under apartheid? So he began his work as a psychologist in the like early 70s, late 60s actually, and at that time there was no place where he could work as a psychologist under supervision of a psychologist. The reason for this was that there were no psychological services for Black South Africans, and indeed it was unthinkable that a Black psychologist could have white clients or patients. So the establishment didn't really know what to do with them. So they placed him in an internship in a neuroscience ward, in a neurology ward, in what is now called the Kasani Baragwanath Hospital. So he had this remarkable experience of like being involved at the with neuro stuff when he was training to be a clinician, actually. So there's this like just by a very unhappy accident, the world of the material or the physical and the symbolic come together. And I'll show you a little bit more about what he does with the domain of the symbolic. But then here, just to think about the way in which words or culture or art is typically understood as severed from the world, but for us to think about how we might put it back in and the entanglement of these two domains, art of life, but also the life of art. So those of us who are interested in narrative or art forms, but those of us who are also interested in life, so it's to put these things back together. Brian Fay says it much better than I just muddled along there. He says that our lives are enstoried and our stories are lived, that stories are in life and life is in stories. So to think about narrative as embodied. Okay, I'm running out of time, but I'll try and zip along. So Mangani gives us this remarkable book. It's very little, but it's a beautiful book. For those of you who don't know it, called Being Black in the World. And this is the place in which he articulates his theory of the psyche that is embodied. And what does it mean if one is Black in a world that is hostile to Blackness? There are resonances with Fanon and Biko, who are more well known, but this really is a remarkable little book. In addition to this work, though, he gives us these, which are really quite remarkable. So I think that Mangani, although he wouldn't necessarily say so, and many others wouldn't agree with me, is a narrative psychologist ahead of his time. He uses the biographic method to inquire into the lives of prominent Black artists. And he does this not so much to focus on their art, but to focus on the ways in which their art shaped their lives and their lives shaped their art. And very detailed studies of each of these wonderful artists. Sekgoto and Feni are both visual artists, and then Batlele's work, which is how I first met Mangani, through literature rather than directly as a psychologist. Okay, very quickly, Mangani says this, that the body constitutes an individual's anchor in the world. It's the physical body which makes it possible for the individual to be given a name, to tell all and sundry who he is, to constitute lived space. Then from Chinua Achebe, this notion that the body and life itself and stories are completely intertwined. Universal creative rondo revolves on people and stories. People create stories, create people, or rather stories create people, create stories. Was it stories first and then people, or the other way around? Okay, beautiful way in which we can see that these things are inseparable. And that's why for me, narrative is just, it has to be the way in which I think about personhood and about social life. I'm going to have to move very fast now. So again, from Mangani, he says that subjectivity is constituted in time and space. And then he has this wonderful concept of freedom in security. So that the way in which we think about this future possibilities of human life is related to a security in the present that allows for freedom and possibility to come from it. And in the absence of this freedom, we become existentially lost, demurred, and life becomes provisional. So can you think for yourself, what would freedom and security look like in your context or place, in your body, if you like? What would it mean to have this openness to freedom in front of you? Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about hope. And here I draw very strongly on Terry Eagleton's beautiful book called Hope Without Optimism. He says that hope is a crack in the present through which we can see the future. So meaningful hope for me has to be about something more than optimism. And it the reason that I say this, and we have to think about what hope would be, is that if we are only optimistic, then we can just kind of be passive. It's not necessary to do anything because things will get better. And in this way, it's not very different from the opposite, pessimism. So when one is a pessimist, you simply cannot do anything about anything because things can only get worse, and they will. Whereas if you're an optimist, you think you don't have to do anything because they're just going to get better. So this leads us to try and think very carefully about what we might be doing, or what it might mean if we think that narrative can stimulate or provoke or provide resources for a hopeful future. And I'm quite obsessed about this notion of hope, so I apologize for those who are not, but I think that it's a very mobilizing and important thing to think about. So the antithesis of hope is not despair or rage, but cynicism. And here I point to the work of my colleague, who's also a NEST affiliated researcher, and that's Hugo Canham. And in that chapter that I sent to you, I engage with his work very directly. So the reason that we need to think about hope as possibly connected to the emotion of despair and rage, and I'm using that word emotion with caution because I don't think that either of these things are simply emotions. But what we see reflected in despair, and then I think more virulently in rage, is that there's an indication that things are not the way they should be or could be. So Canham is quite strong about this and argues that rage produces a force for freedom, a kind of, and it's an expression of active commitments to self and to community. So the antithesis of hope is not despair or rage, but a kind of cynicism, or a kind of a view that it doesn't really matter what I do in the world, and that is what will in fact kill hope. So there's a lovely quote from Toni Morrison, which I'm going to jump over, but she really is pushing us to understand the value of words, even when it seems that words are pretty kind of helpless and hopeless. But there's this argument that those of us who do work in words, whether that be theorizing or whether it be producing art, that this is a moment at which we cannot retreat from the world, and we have to respond to it. So Ezekiel Mpatlele says, sorry, he's a novelist, in case you don't know, and he says that for him, art, or narrative, I want to say, but the production of literary works, fiction, or visual art, or in fact any form, doesn't matter about the modality, dance, and education is for him almost the same thing. Now I find that really very interesting because I'm an educator, but this idea that through narrative and through engaging in educational practice, we can open up the world for readers and for learners. This is what Anne Phoenix has written quite a lot about, this idea of illegible lives and the possibility of narrative to produce coherence or legibility. Dan McAdams refers to this, this practice of making a kind of coherence across time, diachronically, and also across different roles or experiences in the world, synchronically. So I'm moving to the point at which I'm going to let you go into breakout groups and talk to each other instead of listening to me. So I just want to quickly speak about this idea of educational praxis as critical hope, because I think that all of you are involved as students, but also as teachers in the domain of higher education. And this indicates a kind of commitment to this domain as meaningful, as mattering still in the world, because sometimes it feels as if perhaps it doesn't, and that we should go out and do something more practical. You know, if we think about Sunny's participants and the food insecurity and the desperate health demands, sometimes it feels like an indulgence to be talking about ideas, but I don't think it is an indulgence if we pay attention to what it is that we can do with narrative. So the first thing I need to say is that this concept of cruel optimism, which comes from the late Lauren Belant. So they use this idea of, it's a book that they wrote entitled Cruel Optimism, which I found very productive for my thinking. So the idea is that that the late capitalist era offers us a kind of optimism of mobility and a possibility and progress and all these good things, but it's cruel in the way in which it does this, because it leads us to do what they call desire that which does not lead to our flourishing. And I think we quite often have that sense. For me, higher education is in a kind of crisis, because we are peddling a kind of optimism of this kind. It is sort of a kind of pyramid of people buying into this, a pyramid scheme. I sometimes feel that that's all it is, to get a ticket to education, which will buy a better life. And certainly in the South African context, the number of graduates who are unemployed, the number of young people who can't even enter the higher education system, alerts us to the fact that, yeah, education may offer us hope, it may offer possibilities for individuals, it may offer some kind of strengths to nation building or to collective social progress, but it also can thwart those things, depending on how we do it. So now in a slightly more optimistic version from Jabula Ndebele, this idea that the risk of reading, or the risk of education, or the risk of narrative is that it could change your life, and that he sees writing and therefore also, I think, reading as a subversive act. So the narratives that structure our experience, the words and the sources on which we can draw, has this kind of tension that it may in fact open up amazing possibilities for us in the world, but it also may in fact serve to conceal or close down those possibilities. So now I want you to go into breakout rooms for I think at least 10 minutes.